I built a Lego war game, and it's big.
Greetings, Realm Lords. I'm COR, and welcome to my YouTube channel. I am sitting here today with a nearly 10,000 piece game board made out of Lego pieces. This is a massive game board for a massive medieval fantasy war game, a game I call the Circle of Realms. And in this YouTube channel, I'm making various videos that explore the game, its design, and its mechanics for viewers like you. And in this first video, we're going to start by looking at the board itself. This is something I'm particularly excited to share with people because up until very recently, I've been playing this game on a cloth game board. When I first made it, it was on a paper game board. But now, you can see around me, I'm playing it on a 100% Lego piece game board, or at least a game board that's made out of Lego compatible pieces. So let's dive into it. So before we do a deep dive into the time lapse and like what this board consists of, I want to talk a little bit about the game in general, about what I created down here. And I do say created past tense because this is an old concept that I started many years ago when I was in 8th grade. I made like my kind of first version of this game, and then I was updating it throughout high school and in college. When I became an adult, I had to like kind of put it on pause for a while until I could get my own house. But now that I've got a house again, I have the game back in full force. And a lot of the newness of the game right now is this new beautiful board that I've put together and some other kind of just quality changes that I think elevate this and make it to the point where I feel comfortable sharing this game with people online. The game is called Circle of Realms. It is a tabletop war game, maybe something kind of similar to a Warhammer sort of game, but I don't know. It has quite a few differences as well, and this is a marathon game. This is the kind of game where you get together with your friends and you play it for 4 or 5 hours or 6 or 7 hours, and you set it down and you carry on with your lives. You get together again on another weekend and you continue the same game for another 5 or 6 hours or so. I would say that it would normally take like 3 or 4 sessions for us to play through an entire game and get to a winning team. I know not everyone's into that, but that's the kind of game that I really enjoy, is a good, long, high stakes, complex game. There were a lot of inspirations over the years that influenced this as I put it together. It's based very heavily on some video games, like the Heroes of Might and Magic series is one that I took for a lot of inspiration from originally. A lot of how the units work drew inspiration from the old Hasbro toy game called Heroscape, which kind of introduced me to the concept of a miniature game with like kind of a 3-dimensional battlefield. But I've also, over the years, also pulled some things from Warhammer and Dungeons and Dragons. And then also I've pulled just various things from video games I've played as well. There's some influence from Runescape, from Warcraft. Obviously, there's inspiration from Lord of the Rings. You can't escape it if you're doing anything in a fantasy setting. And of course, since I was working within the constraints of building something out of Lego, a lot of this was influenced by Lego's own play sets and themes and pieces that they've released over the years. So the first thing that I had to do before I could even get started really working on the board, obviously, was to make the tabletop that the game is played on. And so I had to buy these wooden boards from, I think it was from Lowe's, and then cut them down to size and put them together into this beautiful little table, which doesn't really look very beautiful, but you can see I'm covering up with Lego pieces anyway, so what does it matter? Now, of course, I'm covering it up with these 6x6 Lego plates, and I've got some examples over here. And I'm doing this for a few reasons. Originally, when I made the board way back, like in 8th grade, so this was like, I don't know, 20 years ago or so, when I made my first board for the game, it was covered in paper. And then I moved to cloth, and then I put like a grid system over the cloth. But now that I am a fully functioning adult with plenty of income, or at least enough income, I can make the board out of actual Lego pieces. And so I'm making it out of these 6x6 plates. And the reason why I'm doing 6x6 plates instead of like very large, like 32x32 base plates or something like that is twofold. Reason number one is that the 6x6 plates create very clear individual spaces. So you can see, even with how tiny I've got the screen over here with the time lapse, you can see individual spaces very clearly. You can tell that units kind of move around on those spaces. The other cool thing I can do with these 6x6 plates is They allow me to remove them from the board if I need to make openings and plop in something new. And that's very helpful because a key aspect of this game is that every team can build different buildings. And so here's an example of a building right here, the Aquiline Hall, which would go down into the space system. So we'd actually just remove the spaces to make room for it, and we'd plop in the Aquiline Hall. And we can do that with any kind of building, really. Moving out of this grassy area, the next place that I'm moving into, you can see has a lot of snow going on in it. And this area, this area with all these white spaces, is known as Legna. So my game board is divided up into 4 major regions, and one of those regions is Legna. Now, originally, in earlier versions of the game, this area had a lot of Mega Bloks pieces in it. It actually had like this big Mega Bloks Dragon's Mountain on it and whatnot, so it had a lot of interesting elevation going on. I would like to still have that interesting elevation, but I'm committing to moving away from having Mega Bloks on my game board, at least in a visible way. So I'm gonna have to build a mountain out of Legos or multiple mountains out of Legos to create this area or make this area a lot more interesting. Each of these 4 regions is a starting area for 2 of my 10 different playable factions in the game. So there are 10 different factions in total. They're all unique from each other. They've got their own strengths and minuses. They have completely different buildings, completely different units, and different play styles. So just to take a quick example, this is one of the Cusped Kingdom's buildings. It's the Aquiline Hall. One of their regular units would be these Kingdom Archers right here. And an example of one of their heroes would be King Mateo de Leon. But every faction has its own non-heroes, its own heroes. They've all got several heroes and several different types of non-heroes, as well as several different buildings that they can build over the course of the game. Here I am now that the screen has rotated. I'm moving away from Legna for a little bit, and I'm working on more of a grassy area. And all of this grassy area on this side of the board is part of a different region known as Mauria. And Mauria is like the most basic region in the game. It's made up of lots of grass. It's going to have trees, more like traditional castle-style buildings and forests. The 2 teams that start in Mauria are both teams that look very much like what we think of when we think of castle-style Lego buildings and units. And none of the terrain here really poses much of a hazard to any players moving around in the area. So as I basically plop down a bunch of these green plates onto the field here, let me tell you guys a little bit about these spaces in general. So this game board consists of almost 5,000 of these spaces. So it's a very large game board. The game board itself is made up of, let's see, we got 1, 2, 3, 4, I think it was 4 by 8 foot wooden baseboards that are then covered with these pieces. Now, this is a lot of pieces. They are not official Legos, most of them, because if I bought these as official Legos, then I'd be looking at a few $1,000s just to make my tabletop here. So I did end up going with knockoffs from Alibaba, but hey, those guys are almost indistinguishable from the real deal. In fact, right here, I have this one, which is an official Lego, and then this one, which is the knockoff. So the 2 look pretty close to each other, pretty similar to each other. You can't really tell, except that the knockoffs don't have the Lego logo on them. But that was definitely worth doing because it brought the cost all the way down to something under $500, which is a lot more manageable for all the parts I have here. And I have extra pieces as well. But in total, it was something like 9,000 pieces to make all of these spaces. A lot of the spaces consist of 2 pieces, which is why I have almost 5,000 spaces on the field. I would definitely recommend that if you tried to make your own game like this and you want to actually do Legos across the whole surface, to consider using perhaps a third-party option to finish up that whole table, unless you've got tons of money. But quite frankly, it's very expensive to get these inauthentic Lego pieces. It's basically impossible to do it secondhand through Bricklink because the quantity is so high. You'd have to actually go through Lego Pick-a-Brick, and those prices are pretty abysmal for pieces that are 6x6 plates. I think it's like 25. I think it was more than that. I think it was almost 50 cents a piece, I feel like, on Pick-a-Brick. And that's a lot of money. If we take that 8,000 pieces, it's going to be somewhere in like the $3,000 or more range. You'll notice as I build the board that Mauria has a river flowing through it, and that river helps separate out our 2 different starting teams and makes this area a bit more interesting. And the continent here also juts out a little bit, which is why that table kind of shifts in a little bit more than the area where I'm basically standing and putting pieces together right now. Like I said, this area will have trees and forests, but in addition, all of the different areas in the Circle of Realms board are going to have weapons scattered throughout them and other items scattered throughout them. So if you're walking around with like a kingdom archer, for example, you might be able to find a new helmet, a new chest piece, some new weapons or shields that you can equip onto the units. I really wanted to take advantage of the fact that Lego minifigures have so much you can do with them. And so I wanted to make sure that when you're making a unit and you're moving it around on the battlefield, you can actually do things to them and change them around and make them look different and fight different as you're playing. In addition to those weapons and armor, there's also going to be resources on the field like gems and gold and treasure chests. And those can all be brought back to your base and exchanged in for like actual gold as a currency, which you can then use to buy more buildings or more units and kind of expand your team's control of the battlefield. It's a lot like a lot of strategy games that were out on the computer. Like, for example, like in Heroes of Might and Magic, you would go around and gather resources, or in a real-time strategy game like Red Alert or StarCraft, going around on the map, gathering different things and bring them back to your base. As I'm shifting over to build the rest of Legna, you can see that I've actually added this rim to the side of the table in between my two cuts here. So the whole board has a frame around it that helps keep everything tightly in place, even though none of this is actually physically attached to the board. I can still remove it all. Now this other part of Legna that I'm working on too will also hopefully have some raised elevation going on to it. I would like there to be a cliff there as opposed to just like stony ground next to the water. Basically everything I can do to get back to that kind of cliffy sort of look I had before when I had this area built with Mega Bloks pieces. Another interesting thing that Legna had because of its weird elevation is that at the top of one of its mountains, it had a witch that would give quests to the players. Now, all 4 regions have one witch in each of them. So there's 4 witches throughout the battlefield, and each of those witches can give the player 1 quest at a time. So a player can have up to 4 quests going on in this game. And quests range from being like very simple quests where you just go and like fetch a particular resource or weapon and bring it back to the witch, to something that's a little more aggressive, higher stakes, where you have to maybe kill an enemy unit or capture them, or capture or kill an enemy hero and return to the witch for your reward. And those rewards are typically much better. I'm not going to be talking about the factions that I'm going to have in Legna right now because they are a bit more exotic and I don't really want to spoil any of them. So just kind of stay tuned, and in future videos they will come out as I start to release my different factions. Now you'll notice I made a much wider river here. I'm not sure if I'm going to keep that river at that width. I might shrink it down a little bit. It's going to depend on the other buildings that I designed for other factions that I kind of want to take advantage of that river with. But in the meantime, we do have this river that kind of cuts through Legna. Legna doesn't quite just end at that river. It goes a little bit farther past it. But as we move out of Legna, you'll see that it's starting to transition into a grassy area again. And that grassy area marks the beginning of our next region, which is called Tordrim. And Tordrim is this region that has a jungle and a desert in it. The factions that are here in Tordrim are also a bit more on the exotic side, so I'm going to hold off on sharing details on them as well. But basically, one of the factions will start in the jungle and another of the factions starts in the desert. If you stuck with me this long to see the board come together, please scroll down and click that like button. If you are interested in seeing more developments that I make to this game board and you want to see how this game works, you want to see all the different factions I have, their buildings, their units, the lore and stories behind them and how it all comes together, then please subscribe to my channel because I'll be uploading videos periodically that showcase different units, different buildings, and modifications that I make to the board as I finish building in those mountains and other details to make it really pop and come alive. You can also go to my website, circleofrealms.com, to see the rules as I upload them and the different units and factions as I upload them online and make videos. So you can watch the videos, you can read about the units, you can actually see their pages online, which are the same pages that we use and we look at when we are playing the game. As I'm plopping this desert into place, I guess we'll talk about the significance of actually having a desert on the battlefield and that snow back in Legna. So there are different terrain types in the Circle of Realms. Most of them are normal. So like we have like grass like I've got over here in Mauria, the beach and dirt and rock, all that's normal, it doesn't really do anything. But we do have 3 different types of hindering terrain that slows down units when they enter into it. And those terrain types are snow, desert, and shallow water, which is the lighter color of the water. And then in addition to those terrain types, we also have 2 types of hazardous terrain. and hazardous terrain will kill units if units enter them and they don't have the ability to survive. Hazardous terrain consists of deep ocean water, like we have basically around the entire rim of the table, and it also consists of lava, which we're starting to see here in Surla. Surla is the last region on the game board. It is the darkest region, both in terms of the types of teams that it has in it, and its terrain types, and just generally the aesthetic around the area. Surla is an area that was devastated by a volcanic eruption, and so it's got lava kind of cracking throughout the area, and it has an area where I would like to have a dead forest as well, as opposed to the kind of vibrant living forests on the other side of the ocean. Surla is the most dangerous region. It is the hardest region to survive in. In addition to having all this lava around in the area, it is also victim to some of the worst environmental conditions. So basically, there are 4 regions on my game map, and there are 2 reasons why it's divided up into 4 regions. Reason number 1 is that there is a witch in each of the 4 regions. And reason number 2 is that each of these regions can be affected by different environmental conditions that are happening on the battlefield. And so these can range from conditions that are just a little bit annoying to ones that can be quite devastating, depending on the player and who all is in that region. So some of the normal environmental conditions that aren't too severe are things like a blizzard, a drought, a rainstorm, or even a solar eclipse. But there are more severe environmental catastrophes that can happen, and those include things like tsunamis, solar flares, earthquakes, and in the region of Surla, they can even include volcanic eruptions. But I'll talk more about that in a later video where we do a deep dive into the environmental effects that can happen in this game. Well, that just about finishes off the board, and so I guess let's go ahead and just take a look at it in its finished form, at least today, what it looks like now currently. Keep in mind that we'll be adding more details and elevation differences to it over time.